Meanwhile, Ukrainian military intelligence has shot down two Russia's fighter jets Su-30 using maritime drones for the first time in the history of modern warfare. What is your assessment of such innovative way to destroy enemy's aircraft?
Well, this is exactly what I'm saying. This is why I think the Russian high command are so vexed by how innovative Ukrainian scientists and Ukrainian military people are being. I was only discussing this on another British radio show this morning. The fact that these drones fitted, we understand, with Sidewinder missiles that are usually on fighter aircraft have now taken down two Russian jets. I mean, that is incredible. We talk about the three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional warfare. I've never been a fighter pilot, so I don't necessarily understand it. But I would have thought fighter pilots are worried about other enemy fighter jets knocking them out of the sky or air defense missiles. But if a maritime drone, autonomous boat in the sea, is now firing these missiles, then that is a really clever way of conducting warfare. And I'm sure, we've discussed this before, the Russian Air Force has really not performed. At the moment, all it can do is really fly in air shows or fly over the parade on this Friday. So when they lose even more to things like these drones, I'm sure that the Russian Air Force, along with the Russian Navy, the Black Sea Fleet, has pretty much run for the hills, as it were, and we haven't seen it because of the ability of Ukrainian military and Ukrainian maritime forces to attack them. This is yet another demonstration on how Ukraine is winning the technology and innovation war and is really unsettling the Russian high command and most especially Putin.
Let's cover also the US-Ukraine minerals deal and its effects on the state of the war. According to the Washington Post, the Russian elites are really concerned about this deal because they fear that this alignment between US and Ukraine could close a window of opportunity for Russia to reach a ceasefire deal on pro-Russian terms. What is your assessment of this development?
Well, I agree. I think it's very successful, very significant. We've in the 100 days that President Trump has been in power, really the dynamics in the world have changed, and the dynamics as far as Ukraine has changed. I think the Russians believed that after President Zelensky was admonished by President Trump a few months ago in the White House that Putin was just going to walk into Ukraine. Well, that situation has so fundamentally turned on its head, and a lot of it is to do with the minerals deal. We all know, and everybody knows, that President Trump is all about transaction and doing business deals, and he now feels that this is a good deal for the US, a good deal for Ukraine, and as such is really behind President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, and is now being demonstratively cross and threatening to the Russians, where before that just had not been the case. So it would appear that the US is turning on their military tap and artillery shells, etc. But I think, psychologically, the most important thing is the Ukrainians hopefully now feel that the Americans have got their back. And as far as the Russians are concerned, they now know that actually the US, quite apart from stepping back, may well step forward, which is the worst possible case for the Russians. So hopefully this move will persuade the Russians that they need to come to the negotiation table and work out a peace deal. And I think it also means, or it seems much more likely now, that Ukraine is going to get a peace deal that satisfies the Ukrainian people rather than a few months ago, it was looking as though they were going to have to literally take any deal on the table. I think it also does very much increase the stakes, because one assumes that we will see, quite a few Americans now working on this mineral deal in Ukraine itself. And Putin will know he cannot afford to injure or kill Americans who are working on commercial ventures in Ukraine. That would absolutely spell disaster. So I think, looking from the outside, it's really put, hopefully, Ukraine in a much better position than it was a few months ago. And although one finds, as a soldier, I find it rather bizarre that America needs to do a business deal before it commits troops, rather than doing it for the morally right thing to do. But hey, that is the world that we live in at the moment. So that and everything else that's been happening in the last few weeks, I think, has turned the tables very significantly in favour of Ukraine. And as I said, let's hope that gets Putin to the ceasefire deal and negotiation table much quicker than anything else can.
Also, after this minerals deal between Ukraine and the United States has been signed, Trump's administration for the first time has approved sale of weapons to Ukraine worth $50 million, according to Kyiv Post. Moreover, the U.S. Department of State has approved the sales of F-16 training and sustainment, along with related equipment, to Ukraine worth more than $300 million. Do you see this as a U-turn, U.S. U-turn, after this deal was signed?
Well, absolutely, because before the deal, we were seeing the Americans holding back on kit. We talked a few months ago, after the Americans turned off the intelligence feed to Ukraine military, and how significant that was. Now we seem to be in a completely different position, where the Americans are prepared to sell ammunition, as you say, administrative and technical support to the F-16 fleet. This is something an ally would do, not one that sits on the fence, which the Americans have been doing. So I think when you put all these things together, with the mineral deal, with the fact that the Russians are really struggling, that the fact that the price of oil is falling through the floor, and most people in Russia thinks their economy is about to collapse, if not disintegrate, it's a very different picture than when we were talking at the turn of the year, when things were looking pretty bad for Ukraine.
Also, according to the Washington Post, there are two groups near Vladimir Putin inside Kremlin. The one group, first group, trying to convince Vladimir Putin to hold the war, to accept a ceasefire deal in exchange for freezing front lines and lifting sanctions against Russia. Another group, more hardliners group, trying to convince Vladimir Putin to continue the war against Ukraine despite all the odds. What kind of group can succeed from your perspective?
Well, I expect this has always been the case. Putin has a very close ring of, I say, friends and advisors around him. But there are some real hawks in the Kremlin as well, some really hardliners who actually see that they perceive a ceasefire now would in fact be a loss for Russia. And when you think a million soldiers have been killed or injured, the economy has been absolutely trashed. It would be very difficult for Russia to recover. But on the other side, people are working out, well, if they stop the fighting now, if the US lifts sanctions and the US supported the oil price to go back up, then Russia does have a chance. However, Putin is obviously the person in the middle here. I think Putin knows that if he accepts a peace deal now from his less hardline colleagues, then that's probably the end of him, because the hardliners will never forgive him. And dictators in Russia who fail, very rarely last long in post. So I think this is why this is adding to the paranoia of Putin at the moment. And it wouldn't be surprising, I think, to see some sort of demonstrative change in Russia in the next few months.
Does it mean that Putin's hardliners can topple his regime, can eliminate him in case of a ceasefire deal?
Well, it's very difficult to know the intimate sort of workings of the Kremlin and his close colleagues and allies. But I think the hardliners are such that they probably would not think twice about getting rid of Putin. If they thought that he was taking Russia in the wrong direction, that is how the Russians seem to work. So I think that is really why we're seeing this paranoia. He's got people on all sides telling him what to do, and he is in a difficult position. And he has a country that is, suffered massively from casualties and massively from its economy. And he knows that, if he makes the wrong decision, that's the end of him. And that is not what drives him. He 25 years as the Russian dictator, he always said that he wanted to leave Russia a much greater place, like some of the other great Russian leaders like Alexander III and Frederick the Great. Well, he could be remembered as one of the worst Russian leaders, not one of the best.
Also, according to the German newspaper Bild, Russian veterans could be another reason why Vladimir Putin hesitates to end this war, because when Russian soldiers will return home, they could cause social instability, committing violent crimes inside Russia. Do you see this as another reason why Vladimir Putin hesitates to end the war, because of his violent veterans coming home, even killing Russian citizens after participating in the war against Ukraine?
Yeah, I think this is a huge consideration. We've already seen that some Russian soldiers returned from the front do commit crimes. Originally, the Russian military was built very much on prisoners. Putin emptied the prisons of tens of thousands of people, giving them their freedom to go and fight. But a lot of them ended back there. I think the Russian soldiers are treated so badly and are just sort of almost ignored by the Russian people, that if they come back, and the only reason that a lot of them are at the front line is actually they get paid quite a lot of money by the Russian state. Once that money dries up, the anxiety, I think, will be huge. And we're talking about large numbers. They're thought to be about 600,000 Russians fighting on the front line at the moment, quite apart from all of those training. So, you could see up to 1 million veterans being integrated back into a society that has struggled massively. So, yeah, it could be a really social headache and could create turmoil across Russia. The final element to this is the mothers of these veterans. We've discussed before that it was the mothers of Russia, the babushkas, who forced Russia to withdraw in defeat from Afghanistan in the 80s, when they suffered 17,000 casualties. Now we're now 1 million. So yeah, there is a lot of social unrest building, I think, and that may well be a factor in Putin trying to prolong the war.
Also, according to the CNN, new intelligence reviewed by US and Western officials suggests that Putin may have shifted his focus in the war in Ukraine towards, quote, short-term objectives of solidifying his hold on territory his forces have seized and boosting his country's struggling economy. Does this mean that Putin begin to realize that his army is unable to capture the whole of Ukraine and is unable to reach his all military objectives?
I think that is absolutely the fact, and as we discussed earlier, a lot of analysts are really saying how little the Russian army has achieved in the last year, and they can't, and their ability to make headways because most of the Russian soldiers are inexperienced conscripts who've had very little training. Therefore, the Russians can only attack at sort of company strength, 100 men at the most at any one time, not integrated with tanks and fighters and drones. They just don't have that ability. So it would be incongruous that they would make any progress. And I'm sure that is seeping back through. I think that is behind the comment in his 25th anniversary documentary at the weekend saying, well, I might have to use tactical nuclear weapons because my army just can't do it. And why I have written in the UK's Telegraph today saying we must be aware of this, and this is where the Americans and others must step up and ensure that Putin doesn't use a tactical nuclear weapon.
You just mentioned about the Russian threat of using nuclear weapons. According to the Telegraph, the United Kingdom is finally preparing for the war against Russia, preparing for a direct military attack by Russia by outlining and updating 20 years old contingency plans to put the country on war footing in case of direct attack. Also, a classified document will set out how the government would respond in case of attack by the Russian side. What is your assessment of this new military planning going on inside the British government?
Well, I think it's quite complex, and if I try and explain it as straightforwardly as possible, as you said, these plans haven't been reviewed for 25 years, and because of everything that's happening at the moment, people have rightly decided that we need to review them. At the end of the Cold War in the 90s, the peace dividend, as we call it, meant that militaries like Britain and other European countries really saved as much money as they can on the military. They saved as much money as they could by not having plans. In the Cold War, there were bunkers all over the UK where politicians and others would hide in if they were being attacked. There were stores of food in case the UK got cut off. And everybody in the country knew what to do if there was a nuclear strike. But for 25 years, we've just forgotten about it. But the UK seems to be very much the focus of a lot of threats coming from Putin. And he is frequently threatened, or his aides like Medvedev have threatened that they'll fire a nuclear missile at London. Now, I don't think anybody really until recently believed that they might do that. And I think it's part of that is what the review's all about. Also, the new government has a strategic defence review that is about to be announced very soon, recognising that Britain needs a stronger military to be able to create a deterrence against Putin. And also, it's the UK and France who are leading what's called the Coalition of the Willing to provide a military force that would ensure that a ceasefire holds in Ukraine, hopefully when we've got it. But all of that put together means that the threats coming out of Moscow and threats coming from Putin, especially on the nuclear side, are now being taken very, very carefully and very seriously in London, because the final bit of this, we've talked about nuclear a few times, but Britain doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons. So if Putin fired a tactical nuclear weapon, the only thing open to Britain would be to fire a strategic nuclear weapon, which would then potentially create a much wider nuclear conflict. So there is an imbalance at the moment. And I think the British and other European countries are trying to make sure that they can redress that, because when Putin looked west back on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence in Europe that would stop him invading Ukraine. And when he looks west now, there is a nuclear imbalance, and that equilibrium needs to be sorted out as soon as possible. So I think it is a demonstration by the British government to Putin that we're serious about this, and Britain is not going to back down and is going to support Ukraine as long as it takes to get a just ceasefire for Ukraine.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.